This is Dr. Ben Weitz with the Rational Wellness Podcast, bringing you the cutting edge information on health and nutrition from the latest scientific research and by interviewing the top experts in the field. Please subscribe to the Rational Wellness Podcast on iTunes and YouTube, and sign up for my free ebook on my website by going to drweitz.com. Let's get started on your road to better health. Hello, Rational Wellness Podcasters. Dr. Ben Weitz here. Thank you so much for joining me again today. For those of you who enjoy listening to the Rational Wellness Podcast, please go to iTunes and leave us a ratings and review. That way more people can find out about the Rational Wellness Podcast. Our topic for today is toxic mold, its effect on our bodies, and how to get rid of it with Dr. Jessica Tran. Exposure to mold and mold toxins, known as mycotoxins, affects many people and often is an undiagnosed underlying trigger for many other symptoms and conditions. Many people are unwittingly living or working in water-damaged buildings, and this exposure may be causing many negative effects on their health, including skin rashes, respiratory problems, cognitive, neurological issues, fatigue, headaches, joint pain, even increased urinary frequency, and a list of other symptoms. When looking at a patient from a functional medicine perspective, we usually focus on likely underlying triggers and root causes of their health condition, and mold may be one that is sometimes overlooked. Research indicates that mycotoxins can bind to DNA and RNA and cause damage, alter protein synthesis, increase oxidative stress, deplete antioxidants, alter cell membrane function, act as potent mitochondrial toxins, and alter apoptosis, which is important for killing off cancer and other cells that we don't want in the body. Molds and mycotoxins can negatively affect our hormones, including our sex hormones, thyroid, and adrenal function. In some cases, POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, and a bunch of other conditions can be caused by mold exposure. Other conditions that may have a mycotoxin component include various cancers, diabetes, atherosclerosis, heart disease, hypertension, autism, rheumatoid arthritis, lipid problems, Crohn's disease, Sjogren's syndrome, MS, Alzheimer's disease, etc. This is why we've asked Dr. Jessica Tran to join us today. Dr. Tran is a board-certified naturopathic doctor, having completed her naturopathic degree from Bastyr University. She also completed a 3-year specialty environmental medicine fellowship, and she also recently completed an MBA in healthcare from UC Irvine. Dr. Tran is extremely knowledgeable about mold and mycotoxins and environmental conditions. And this is why we've asked her to join us to share some pearls of wisdom with us today. Dr. Tran, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. So how did you become interested in environmental medicine and studying mold and patients suffering with mold toxicity?
It was through my fellowship program at Southwest that I became more familiar with mold. It was never on my radar. It wasn't anything I ever learned in undergrad or even living in Seattle, where it's very moldy and damp. I rarely had encountered anyone or any patients that came in for us with symptoms that remotely resembled mold toxicity or mold allergy. I was probably seeing them, but it wasn't anything that was exposed to me at that time. So in my fellowship program, because I was at the Center of Environmental Excellence there, we saw patients from around the globe. And it was there that I had patients come in, and it was through my mentor and faculty director who, through our history, uncovered that patients who are living in water damaged homes or had exposure to mold, had chronic illnesses that after seeing 40 or many, many different doctors, their symptoms and condition was resolved. One of the things that really fascinated me was that you can have mold exposure, not even see it in your home because it could be behind the drywall of the home. And patients would usually have a history of, yeah, we had water damage, we cleaned it up, or the toilet overflowed, but we then, part of the fellowship program, we learn about like building practices and how to ask certain questions. We have our patients or a home inspector go in, take a look, and lo and behold, sometimes people would have like black mold behind like their shower wall or their, in their bathroom or even their home or kitchen sink, roof leak. And that was really where I learned a ton about patients who are exposed to mold and having mold mycotoxin issues.
Cool. So what would make you suspect that a patient that you're dealing with may have an underlying mold problem that's part of their health struggles, especially when the symptoms of mold toxicity could also be caused by a number of other things?
I think that's the hardest aspect. It's usually for most, as a general practitioner, it's really hard to know because patients are coming with fatigue, joint pain, all these other things. And there's so many different things that you can evaluate. And they have, for me, sometimes I'm one of the last people that patients see, and it's a diagnosis of exclusion. If it's something that a doctor hasn't looked at, it's something that I usually ask. So one of the things that are strange, rare, peculiar, that patients will come and being overlooked is patients with dementia or Alzheimer's. And to this date, I've had a handful of patients who have triple negative breast cancer, and hands down, every single person has had a tremendous mold exposure. So there's certain cancers that I believe either we don't know if it's the culprit, but it's definitely an association that we see. It's definitely something that's, for me, just my bias is strongly correlated that I see in my practice. So, we take an environmental perspective, environmental history, and part of the history, somebody who has many chronic illnesses, or I would say 3 or 4 conditions like hypothyroidism, Lyme, infection, or other allergies, most of them will struggle with a mold intolerance, and that could be mold allergy or a mycotoxin issue. And the mycotoxin issue, we get mycotoxins from our food, right? So we're all exposed to mycotoxins to some degree. And our body naturally will eliminate mycotoxins on its own. But as you know, people who struggle with like metal issues, their ability to eliminate may be slowed based on their genetics. So they may have a compromised ability to eliminate, even though naturally we all have the ability to eliminate it. Some people eliminate slower than others. And because it's slower, there's a buildup that occurs. And we develop this toxic burden. And it's not just with mold, it's with other things like metals, in the environment, glyphosate, like different herbicides, pesticides that we're exposed to also. So it's the totality of everything that we have to look at. But definitely the mold mycotoxin issue is huge. And it's hard to really know if it's how big a factor it is. Always asking a patient about whether they have water damage in their home. And most patients who are mold sensitive will know because through their history. They'll have itchy eyes, runny nose. When they walk into a damp room, they'll know. And others may not. So it's a good history is what I'd say.
So what percentage of patients that have symptoms of mold toxicity or that do have mold toxicity know that their home or office has mold that they're getting exposed to?
Surprisingly, I believe, maybe my patients are more educated. They will say to me, I think my home Maybe I'm mold sensitive because I'll read about it online. But for most patients, I think they don't suspect it because it's never anything that they're clued into. So
Right.
I actually believe it may be more undiagnosed than we ever realize it to be. Because it's something that's not really talked about or taught in conventional medicine. Most conventional practitioners will send a patient to an allergist. The allergist will do a skin scratch test. It may not even show up because a lot of times the mold allergy is not IgE mediated. It may be a delayed response. And so we may
An IgG or IgM reaction.
There are patients who are immune compromised that are more susceptible to getting certain mold infections, especially in their lungs. When patients are immune compromised, that's recognized in conventional medicine. But for people who have a low level toxin exposure with mold accumulation, it may be overlooked.
You mentioned triple negative breast cancer, and we've had a few patients with that over the years, and that's really a grim prognosis, very hard cancer to treat. Do you find that treating the mold increases their prognosis?
It's hard to say, but in my experience caring for these patients with triple negative, their prognosis is better. And I think it's because we're doing everything else, right? We're changing their diet. We're helping them decrease stress. I think it's everything together. But I say that with the triple negative breast cancer because, there isn't anything, the prognosis is terrible. Some patients go on a round of different chemotherapy agents, which really have no evidence, which blows my mind because it's supposed to be research science-based. But I know they're doing their best. They're trying to find the best regimen for patients. And I find that a lot of my patients with the triple negative breast cancer, and comparing to people who decide to go conventional versus integrating, the functional medicine, alternative medicine aspect, they do better because of everything they're doing. Diet, lifestyle, supplements. I think diet play and hormonal balance. Like if it's even though estrogen, progesterone isn't playing a role, there's cortisol, the adrenal hormones, right? So that plays a role too. We have to address that.
Yeah, and I'm not convinced, even though they're estrogen receptor negative, that estrogen metabolism still isn't important in these women.
Oh, and it's gut, right? The gut function. Gut function is essential, right? Our diversity of our microbiome is very important.
Yes.
How our gut, B vitamins are important. If the patient has dysbiosis, they're most likely to have an altered level of Bs. And we know that there's so many different cofactors in our body that we need for metabolism, for essential detoxification. I really believe, for triple negative and certain types of cancer, it's the depletion of essential nutrients that leads to altered or uncontrolled growth of cells, right? So that's why when we see patients with certain cancers, we're always looking at nutrient levels and how can we support them from that. And food is medicine. So we start there first and look at how will they absorb. If we can't do that, we go through higher levels of intervention. They may need like IV nutrient therapy.
Right. Do you find any tests useful for screening patients for mold toxicity, such as, say, some of the urine tests?
They can be useful, yes. So the caveat for that is that when you do these urine tests, it doesn't tell you what your burden is. It tells you your level of exposure. And it tells you you're able to excrete. Similar to toxic metals, so there are some people who are non-excretors. They don't excrete well. What I do find in the patients who are poor excretors, they're not going to have a high level of mycotoxins in their urine. It's going to actually show a low level. And it's kind of counterintuitive, but then what I learned, and I learned this through Dr. Tim Guilford, that glutathione binds to mycotoxins. So what I've done in patients where I know they're living in a water damaged home, I know they have every classic symptom, but the urine test shows that it's negative, I do a glutathione challenge. So the day before, I will either dose with liposomal glutathione throughout the day, like 500 milligrams 3 times a day, or I'll do an IV bolus of glutathione drip or push, and then collect the next morning first urine void, and then you'll see it.
Cool.
So I do have a case. I can show you with the lab results at the presentation. So the whole family has exposure living in a moldy home. And there's one, the mom has very high levels of ochratoxin, the aspergillus in the home from the air samples of the home. Her urine test shows that she's exposed. Yeah, that's what it shows. Her son, who has developmental delays and issues, his levels showed very little, like nothing excreted out. And the interesting thing is that the son saw my colleague in the office, Dr. Ingalls. So he did, I recommended the test. He saw the results. He's like, oh, okay, no exposure. But when you look at, because they're exposed, the kid has to have some, excretion. But what it tells me is that this kid is a poor excreter. So he's probably very, very burdened, but he's not excreting well.
Did you do the glutathione and retest with him?
Yeah, and so you'll see when you do the glutathione and then you retest, you see a greater level of excretion, maybe not a ton. And I have a handful of cases where that's the case, where classic, mold exposure, other practitioners will do, I see them, they'll see other practitioners around town, they have a test, it's negative, and I'm like, let's try this. Let's try a glutathione challenge test. And then lo and behold, you see a greater excretion of mold mycotoxins. And I believe it's because it's just stuck, stored, or whatnot in the body, and it wasn't treated well. And we see that with metals. So it's my experience in metal toxicology with the chelators, and that has I drew from that to apply in this situation.
Meaning when somebody comes in you suspect might have heavy metal toxicity, instead of just measuring their urine, you give them an oral chelator, and then you measure their urine the next day with the idea that the chelator is pulling the metals out that then will get excreted.
Exactly. That's an exact concept. Because we don't really, when we're doing a first morning urine challenge test, either for the mold or heavy metals, just first, no chelator, first morning void, it just shows us what the patient's exposed to and how well they're able to eliminate. It doesn't tell us what's bound, or like for metals, we know this for metals really well, is that certain metals will bind very strong to proteins and make certain enzymes non-functional. And it's the affinity of these metals that bind it so strongly. But when you have a chelating agent on board, it pulls it off and then frees it up, and then you excrete it out through the urine. So same concept. And I don't know if are you familiar with the autism study when they looked at the baby's first haircuts and looking at mercury?
No.
There's a study looking, because we had believed that mercury was implicated in developing autism. So there's a study that looked at babies' first haircuts. And we expected to see a higher level of mercury excretion in kids on the spectrum. But the opposite, it was what the study showed. It was, in fact, the neurotypical kids, the controls, had high levels of mercury versus the autistic kids. And that study demonstrates and illustrates the fact that the autistic kids are poor excretors. So their genetics doesn't allow them to excrete. That's kind of the takeaway from that study.
I see.
Same way, and we have a study similar, which I'll talk about. Same thing with children on the spectrum. do not excrete ochratoxin very well either. So you'll see the control group will excrete really well, but the children on the autistic spectrum will not excrete ochratoxin very well. The study doesn't take the leap to do a glutathione challenge test or anything, but hopefully one day we'll get there. But the research does show that there are people who just do not excrete very well.
Cool. What's the best way to test their home for mold or mycotoxins?
There's different ways to test. So you can do a spore trap analysis. You have somebody come to the home, measure the spores in the home. You could do the inexpensive way to do it. I tell some of my patients you can get a petri dish, you go Home Depot or buy on Amazon online a petri dish mold, test. Just put it in the home, and if you just leave it in the home for a couple of days, then you send it back and you get a report. Not very expensive. I usually have and recommend patients to get it evaluated by a mold expert or somebody who comes in the home. It can do the moisture testing, looking at indoor mold samples and outdoor mold quality. There's some people who talk about the ERMI and the HERPSMI, and so we'll go over that at the presentation, the pros and cons. But in a nutshell, the ERMI is a more extensive evaluation. The HERPSMI is looking at the 5 molds, mycotoxin producing molds that Shoemaker believes are most has the most adverse effects on our health. So those are the differences in the nutshell.
Okay. So let's get into treating. So how do you treat a patient that we believe strongly or is confirmed from testing are sick from mold or mycotoxin exposure?
So for treating a patient, you also have to not only look at the mold, you look at the whole entire person. You have to look at the food allergies and their other environmental allergies to get the best resolution. So there are some people who will just treat in isolation, and I feel like we will do a disservice if we just do that. But there's some people who just want just the mold component. And if you look at just the mold component, what the evidence shows is that liposomal glutathione, IV glutathione, does bind to the mycotoxins. If we're talking about mycotoxins alone, glutathione in conjunction with phosphatidylcholine to help improve the lipid membrane is essential, because we know it impairs cellular and the lipid bilayer. So phosphatidylcholine is another. Oral or IV is something that can be used. Looking at the gut microbiome is really important.
So it's interesting you talk about liposomal glutathione as something that binds to the mold. I often hear of people talking about using liposomal glutathione or other forms of glutathione as a way to push the mold out, and then using clay and charcoal and pectins and things like that to bind it.
Yes.
One of the experts calls it the push catch strategy.
I mean, you have in my experience, if we had to pick one, my glutathione is my favorite.
Okay.
The binders, yes. And some people like to use chlorostyrene. I find that it's really harsh. So there are other binders that are good, like psyllium, the bentonite clay. That's good. It's hard to find a good source of that too. It's fairly inexpensive. Like some people will take activated charcoal
right.
at night. And I think it's essential for us to know how to schedule it so patients don't deplete their nutrients more than they are depleting their nutrients.
Right, because those binders, if they're consumed at the same time with foods that have a lot of nutrients or nutritional supplements, they'll bind with those too and take them out.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And we do a lot of gut work too when patients are exposed to mold. Some patients are like, why are you making me do a stool test? Like, it's part of the evaluation, because it's not just because mold has a relationship with candida too. Some people who have an overgrowth of candida will just experience the symptoms of mold allergy and toxicity to a greater degree. So we want to make sure we evaluate it and we treat it appropriately too. And so that's why I like the sensitivity testing on, our functional comprehensive stool analysis, because we can actually treat with the correct nutraceutical.
Cool. Of all those binders, I've seen clay, charcoal, cholestyramine, chlorella, zeolite, modified citrus pectin, beta sitosterol, glucomannan, diatomaceous earth. Can you sort those out, or what are your few favorites, or do you like to use some in certain cases?
I would say my favorite would probably be like the bentonite clay and activated charcoal.
Okay.
And there's different soluble fiber products that I like to use too. I think fiber is important because that also helps, and it really depends on the patient's budget too. So activated charcoal is relatively really inexpensive, and it is something that's put on board for just to help. But if they can do the different fibers and we rotate the fibers, that's something that I like. And some people can't tolerate one fiber over the other, so that's why you have to understand what their intolerances are too.
Okay. Interesting. Hey, have you noticed that we seem to be in this charcoal phase of consumer products? In fact, in my house alone, my wife had brought home toothpaste with charcoal, facial mask with charcoal. Occasionally we have a treat of ice cream made from coconut. And they have a flavor that is charcoal ice cream.
I think it's a new trend and fad. I was with a friend.
It's everywhere. It's charcoal.
I was with a friend this weekend and I ordered a lemonade charcoal, and she's like, "What is this?" And I'm like, "It's lemonade charcoal. It's a trend here." And we went and had an amazing bowl in Los Angeles, and it had charcoal in it, and she's like, "I can't, why is there charcoal in everything?" I'm like, just wait. In a couple of months, 6 months from now, it's going to head up to Portland everywhere there. But it's trending here in LA.
Right.
It's everywhere.
Yeah, I guess.
Lemonade. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we haven't had a new fruit that only grows in the Amazon that's the new super antioxidant. So we got charcoal now.
No, we have tried. I can tell you about other exotic fruits that hasn't been well talked about.
Okay. Maybe we could start a trend right here on the Rational Wellness Podcast.
I'll bring that to you next time. Other botanicals and nutrients that aren't trending yet. That will
okay. We'll be the trendsetters. So when you're treating a patient for mold or mycotoxin toxicity, do you have them avoid foods that may contain mold, or and do you have them avoid eating mushrooms, by the way, which is another trend, is foods that have dried mushrooms in them, like reishi and chaga and whatever the latest trendy medicinal mushroom is.
Of course,
that's put in coffee and tea and everything else?
Yeah, so it really depends on the patient's tolerance. And that's the other thing, is making sure we understand the patient's food intolerances. In general, most providers who are treating patients with mold will say avoid all of it, even avoid the mushrooms, avoid cheese, everything. I find that some patients will be able to tolerate taking cordyceps or reishi for adrenal support when they're mold sensitive, but there are other patients who cannot tolerate it. So it's patient specific. We really have to identify patient's needs. Yeah. So as a blanket statement, I think in general, sure, you can avoid it, but I think mushrooms have such beneficial uses, and I also believe there are good uses of mold. Not all molds are bad.
But we could very easily say, since these are common foods that have mushrooms, and they're also very common allergens, say avoid wheat, corn, cheese, there's a few other common foods that also are probably irritating to the gut. You could easily take those out as part of your program and improve their overall health. Take out alcoholic beverages.
Yes. Yeah, you can.
Should we be using an air filter?
I think everyone just live, in Orange County, LA area, I think we should air filter.
What's the best kind of air filter to get?
It depends on what you're trying to eliminate out. So what I tell patients,
mycotoxins.
So if you're looking to get rid of mycotoxins and mold spores, you want to look for an air filter that has a MERV 8 rating at least. So each filter will have a different rating, and I'll show that to you in the presentation. There's different types of air filters and qualities, and the issues with air filter is, you can have a charcoal carbon filter, air filter, or you can have one with ozone. And then people will say that certain air filters will emit too much EMF. So you have to look at the EMF excretion, the emission of EMF.
Yeah, I just did a podcast with Orem Miller, and he's the EMF guy. Yeah, he spoke at our last functional medicine meeting as well. Yeah.
So one of my favorite air filter, which is the IQ Air, he and other people will say it emits too much EMF for certain patients. So I like the IQ Air, the Blue Air, or the Austin Air, or the 3 top air filters that it was just passed down from me. I'm just kind of regurgitating that information. And in our industry is what we recommend to patients. And there are other ones like the
what are those 3 again, real quick?
The IQ Air.
IQ Air.
IQ Air is big and bulky, right?
Okay.
But it's beautiful, but it's quite expensive. The Blue Air is nice and sleek, and
so we can turn our home into a blue zone with the Blue Air filter.
Yeah, and some people the Molecule, which is newer, and I have one in my office.
Could you repeat that last one, because you're kind of broke up a little bit?
I apologize on my internet. I am hardwired though. Is the Molecule. The Molecule is the last one that a lot of newer, or a lot of people have been talking about. I actually have 3 in my office. I love it.
Oh wow.
I have every single one in my office. I have the Blue Air, Austin Air, and just so that I can show patients the different types of air filters they can pick for their home. And I think honestly, like anything at Costco is good too. If they want to go to Target, most products at Target are sufficient too. It does,
but don't buy your fish oil at Costco.
I know. I don't get that, but yeah, it's interesting. But yeah, the quality of Costco fish oil is just.
Oh my God.
We'll talk about. I don't know if do you talk about that on your podcast, because I don't think the consumer public knows about the quality of different fish oils.
I haven't done a podcast just on that, but it's definitely something I'm passionate about. But I definitely should. I mean,
I would tell you, I have lab results for patients who take my supplement and then they want to go to Costco, get it for less expensive, and like their numbers change. And I'm like, well, yeah. And I just don't pay attention because my staff deals with like the dispensary. So I know you're taking supplements, and I'm like, well, what supplement are you taking? And they show me this Costco bottle, and I'm like, I cringe.
Oh, I know. And it's the size of a garbage can, and it costs like $20. And you going, what do you think? You think you're going to get quality?
Or like titanium dioxide. I mean, which is in a lot of supplements and medication can be safe. But there's a lot of coloring and fillers.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't even, you read the label, and you're like, wow.
I know.
But it is something, and if it's what they can afford, and something is better than, but it's not, I don't know.
Yeah.
Situation.
Okay, Jessica. So thank you for providing us with some very interesting, useful information about mold. How can listeners and viewers get a hold of you? How can they contact you?
At my office or through email?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what's your website, and you can give out your office phone number, and you do consultations in person, and do you also do them remotely?
I do for certain situations. Yes.
Okay.
So my website is wellnessintegrative.com.
Okay.
And also my office number is 949-551-8751. And I'm on at drjessicatran.com. Instagram is Dr. Jessica Tran. And I also have a Facebook page, I guess. People message me through my Facebook.
Okay, good.
So Dr. Jessica Tran, naturopathic doctor.